Hey, Bill Lethman here for Money Evolution. In today's video, I'm going to show you how you could save $96,880 in Affordable Care Act premiums by qualifying for a subsidy. And before you just quickly dismiss this video and say, hey, that's not going to apply to me, I have way too much in portfolio assets, we're going to be walking through another case study hypothetical example using our hypothetical clients, Tim and Jill Mitchell, and they have over $2.5 million of portfolio assets. In fact, having worked with hundreds of financial plans over just the past few years, we've actually worked this out with some clients that have $3 million and even over $5 million of investable assets. So when we're talking about Affordable Care Act premiums, we're really talking about that pre-Medicare situation where you're not yet Medicare eligible, and these premiums can be quite high. So in 2025, according to the Kaiser Family Foundation, one of the most respected institutions for everything healthcare statistics related, the average cost for an Affordable Care Act Silver plan, not even the best plan that's out there, but the Silver plan would cost for a 60-year-old individual $1,072 a month or $12,864 a year. So these are big numbers here. And if we're talking about a couple, we're just going to, of course, double that number to $25,728. So if we're talking about a 60-year-old couple that needs these Affordable Care Act insurance policies for 5 years until they're Medicare eligible at 65, that's going to be $128,640. And what we haven't included here is the annual cost of increases that are likely going to happen on those policies as they naturally do. But $128,640 is going to be that number. So to qualify for a subsidy, there are some rules to this, and it's going to be based off of something called the federal poverty level. And it's going to be basically between 100% and 400% of that federal poverty level. Now, there was some new legislation that came in during the pandemic that extended some of these subsidies through 2025. So we're filming this in 2025, so this will apply for this year, where those premiums are going to be capped at 8.5%, even if you're over that 400%. But beginning next year in 2026, it's going to be more of a cliff. So if you're just $1 over these levels at that 400%, you're not going to get any subsidy at all. So we're not going to focus too much of what this looks like at the lower end, but we're really, during the course of our case study here, we're going to be looking at what that could be even if you were at the upper end of that 400% there. To give you an idea, the federal poverty level for 2025 was $15,650, and then if you're married, you get an additional $5,500 for your spouse. And we're going to assume here that there's probably not going to be any dependent kids or anything like that if you're up in this age 60 here. But basically what that means is that, if you're looking at a couple here, your 100% would be at $21,150, and then the upper end of that at 400% would be $84,600. So the goal here, if we can, is to basically keep the modified adjusted gross income for our hypothetical clients under that $84,600 so that we can qualify for one of these subsidies. So let's take a look at what that looks like here. So if we're just talking about the amount of subsidy that you would get if you were at the upper range of that federal poverty limit at that 400% level, if we're talking about a single individual before the subsidy, the cost would be that $12,864. After the subsidy, that cost would drop to just $3,512 per year. So you would save $9,352 per year. And if we're talking about multiple years here, we can just do the quick math and see how much long-term savings that potentially could be. For a married couple, assuming you're both going to be on these Affordable Care Act exchanges, that would be $25,728 per year before the subsidy, and then that would drop to just $7,024 after the subsidy, saving $18,704 per year. So we're going to jump right into our software here, and we're going to kind of lay this out for the Tim and Jill Mitchell, and we're going to talk about some of the strategies and some of the techniques that we're going to do or think about as we're trying to bring that income down and keep it under that 400% of the federal poverty level. Okay, so now we're going to hop over into our financial planning software, and the tool that we're using for this is a program called eMoney, and we're actually using the advanced planning module of the eMoney financial planning software here. And it's the centerpiece of our retirement planning program that we created called the Retirement Time Machine. We'll put some links down in the description below for that, or you could just head over to retirementtimemachine.com for more information. So here we are, we're in the Tim and Jill Mitchell financial plan here, and I did another case study on this. I actually actually have done several case studies on them. So Tim is 60, Jill is 58 years old. They were originally planning on working for a couple more years, but through some unforeseen events, they were forced into early retirement through some downsizing here. And so we can see their original plan and working a few more years here had a very high level of confidence here. But when we look at their plan with that new downsizing here, we can see what is projected to happen to their portfolio assets over time. And so even though they're not projected to run out of money, this has a much lower level of confidence than their original plan did. And if we were to have a sideways market or a major market downturn, especially if that happened in early retirement, that would probably leave them in a position where they likely could run out of money. So the first thing we want to do before we even get into any of this discussion about ACA is we want to get this retirement plan a little bit better shape here. But before we do that, I want to point out one thing, and I want to look at the income tax for that downsized scenario here. And so even though they don't have a very high level of confidence, when we look at the column for regular federal income tax, they have adjusted gross income. And that's one of the things we really like about the software that we're using, is to be able to have this granular level of detail. Because if you remember, the Affordable Care Act subsidy, that 400% of the federal poverty level, is going to be based off of modified adjusted gross income. So adjusted gross income is going to correlate very closely to that. For some people, and the Mitchells don't have this situation, but you might have to add in a few things to that adjusted gross income if you have things like tax-free municipal bond interest or foreign earned income, things like that would maybe make that go up a little bit. The other thing that's going to really matter, two other things. One is how much money they need to spend each year, and that's going to be something that's going to show up on the cash flow report, but also where are you potentially going to pull those assets from. So if you had a whole bunch of money in non-retirement accounts and it was all sitting in a bank account, you could essentially draw that money out every year, and because it's money that's in cash, essentially you wouldn't have to pay any capital gains taxes on that money. You might have to pay interest taxes on the interest income that you earn, but that would be a much different situation. For the Mitchells, they have most of their money in traditional retirement accounts. In fact, many of the people, most of the people probably that we work with, have the majority of their retirement assets in traditional retirement accounts, which means that if you don't have money in those non-retirement accounts, or when that money runs out, you'll almost be forced to take distributions for your living expenses to take them out of traditional retirement accounts, and that could push you up into a higher tax bracket. So we can see for the Mitchells, 2026, they have a very low adjusted gross income because they do have some cash assets, so very little tax due on that. And then in the following year, in 2027, they're at about $85,000. So they're just over where that 400% level is. And remember, it's a cliff, so if you're $1 over, you're not going to get that subsidy. But if there is some inflationary increases between now and 2027, it could be that they still might qualify for an Affordable Care Act subsidy in that 2027 year. But the year after that and all the way through until Tim and Jill both reach their Medicare age, there's probably no way that they're going to get an Affordable Care Act subsidy with this scenario the way that it's laid out. So that's going to be a problem. They're going to have higher healthcare expenses for those years, in addition to having a plan that doesn't have a very high level of confidence here. So when we look at this, we can start to really map in some of these different scenarios, and we are going to look at that. So one of the things that Tim and Jill talked about, and they talked about it even before they got downsized from their job, but maybe the idea of downsizing their house. And we basically looked at this and we said, what if they were to downsize their house? They currently have a home that's about $1.1 million, but if they downsize that to a $750,000 house, a couple things would happen. One is their mortgage would go away once they sell that house. So if we sold that house in 2026, that would pay off their mortgage, and then they would also have some proceeds from the sale of that house, because even after paying off their mortgage, they still have some positive equity that they could put into some of those non-retirement account assets and giving them a little bit more extension of covering some of those living expenses until their Medicare kicks in there. So we can see that that got their financial position in a lot better shape. If we hop back over to the income tax report, that's going to extend that out a couple more years, but doesn't quite get them all the way to age 65, especially for Jill being 2 years younger. You have 7 years now before she's going to be eligible for Medicare. So we continue to build this out. I'm not going to get into all the detail here, but we basically redesigned this and said, okay, our goal essentially is to qualify for that affordable care subsidy. So we did a reduction of those healthcare expenses in the early part of retirement down to that level that it would be at that 400% qualification under the federal poverty level there. They also have some inherited stock, and this is going to be another opportunity to do two things for them. One, give them some more money and some more assets that they can have in that bucket that they can use in those 7 years while they're still trying to stay in a relatively low adjusted gross income or modified adjusted gross income to qualify for the ACA subsidy. And as we're going to see here too, they're going to qualify for a 0% long-term capital gain tax rate. So that's something I've talked about in other videos, and you might already know that that's a possibility, but if your income is under, I think it's like $96,800 for 2025, then if you have long-term capital gains, you don't pay any taxes on that. The other thing, I'll come back to that in a second here, but if we come back and look at that income tax report here, now we can see that this is getting a little bit better. I need to change that scenario. You can kind of see how fast we can do some of these changes here. And so now we can see their adjusted gross income, $80,000 for this year because they have that capital gain. And we can also see what their tax is, and so their tax effectively is zero, even though they have some of that taxable income there, and it's because of that 0% long-term capital gain. And the program, the software eMoney, is smart enough to realize that as long as we put the right inputs in there and map it out correctly. Then they're going to have some relatively low levels of income there, so through 2029, they should probably be qualifying for that affordable care subsidy. 2030, maybe not, depending on how much inflation was on that federal poverty level between now and 2030. But again, here in 2031, Tim will be eligible for Medicare, but Jill still has a couple more years here that she may not get that subsidy because their income could be too high here. So the last thing we did, and this is something we might want to do anyway, is we said, okay, well, let's fill up some of those gaps there a little bit more. And if we go into that, went into the wrong thing here. So we go back into the Decision Center. And what we're going to do here is we're just going to turn on some 401k withdrawals here. And that's going to improve their overall situation. But when we go back over into the income tax, we can see what that looks like here. And now we've created a much smoother level of income, so they're taking advantage of some of those lower tax rates in there and still staying well below that adjusted gross income. And this would even be something too as a further opportunity because we don't know what the 400% of the federal poverty level is going to be in 2027 or 2028, for example. But if we know how much income we have, there may be even some opportunities to do some Roth conversions in there too, to fill up more of that low income tax bracket and still stay underneath where we need to be for the Affordable Care Act there. So now we're getting all the way through, and basically then when their income does finally jump up there, they are now both going to be eligible for Medicare here. And when we go over to the cash flow, we can see a couple things happening here. One of those is now what we've started to do, in addition to kind of mapping in this Affordable Care Act, we've also gone in and really created our retirement income plan, because now we can see exactly what's happening. So in 2026, we have some proceeds coming in from the sale of their house as they're downsizing. We have that inherited stock. So even though there's going to maybe be a $50,000, $60,000 capital gain in there, they're going to actually fill up that cash flow bucket by $110,000 roughly. They have some CDs that are maturing that are in here, and a little bit of this core cash. That's going to be basically some of that money where that house sale went to for that. And then the next year we have some withdrawals starting for the 401k. For 2027 and beyond. We said $50,000 a year. We added a little bit of an inflation factor, so that goes up a little bit each year. They still have some CDs, a high yield savings account, checking accounts, things like that that can be used up. And then they also have some brokerage assets there. And we can continue to build this out as we go through time to see exactly where that money is coming from each year. So I hope this all made sense. I kind of got a little bit into the weeds here with some of the detail here, but the financial planning software is really very robust. And these are all pretty much based off of client situations that we work with over time. And sometimes it's hard to really kind of develop a hypothetical situation and kind of figure out how much money goes into each one of those buckets as we start to map it out. But everyone's situation is going to be different, but generally speaking, there's a lot of strategies that can be used. If, for example, you or let's say Tim and Jill in this case had all of their money in those traditional retirement accounts, there's another thing we could do too, is you could say in the first year of retirement, because again, we want to fill up our cash flow buckets so that we can get us or extend us out until when that Medicare is eligible for you or you and your spouse. And so if you went on COBRA for the first year of retirement, you could take a very large distribution from your retirement accounts. It wouldn't keep you in the Affordable Care Act subsidy for that first year, but COBRA expenses are a little bit less than what they probably would be if you were to go out into the exchanges. Right now, according to the research that's out there, it's about $700 a month per person to go on COBRA. And you can go on COBRA for up to 18 months. So if you got downsized in the middle of 2025, you could have COBRA extend you through the rest of 2025 and then even all the way into 2026. So then you wouldn't have to be on quite the constriction for the amount of income that you have. And then in 2027, you build up that cash bucket beforehand, and now you're just going to be distributing that. And then you maybe couple that buildup of those cash reserves from the large withdrawal from your retirement account, along with maybe taking a $50,000, $60,000 IRA or 401k withdrawal that's still going to keep you under that Affordable Care Act subsidy. So again, I hope this was helpful. Again, if you want to learn more about the Retirement Time Machine program, you can head over to retirementtimemachine.com. We've got links down in the description below. We also have some great free resources as well and some great information over on our website at moneyevolution.com. Lots of websites there, but check all of that out and look forward to seeing you back in one of our next videos. Thanks.